June 5th, 1944. A quiet night. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows along the French coast. For the German High Command, this foul weather was a blessing in disguise. It meant peace. Inside the cozy, smoke-filled rooms of their headquarters, maps were rolled up, drinks were poured, and a sense of calm settled over the officers. The English Channel was a churning mess, a tempest of gray waves. No sane commander would attempt a sea crossing in this. An invasion. Impossible. Utterly impossible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man tasked with defending this coastline, was so confident that he had left his post. It was his wife's birthday, and he was on his way back to Germany to celebrate with her. A rare moment of personal peace in the midst of a world war. He even planned to stop by Hitler's headquarters afterward to plead for more Panzer divisions. But for tonight, the war could wait. His subordinates felt the same. Many senior officers were away from their coastal posts, attending war games in Rennes, far from the beaches. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost leisurely. The invasion alerts, which had kept them on edge for weeks, were downgraded. The prevailing thought was simple. The Allies wouldn't dare. Not in this storm. Back at Hitler's mountaintop retreat, the Berghof, the Führer was also in a relaxed mood. He had entertained guests, listened to music, and retired to bed late, secure in the knowledge that his Atlantic wall was impregnable. His meteorologists had assured him the bad weather would hold for at least 2 weeks. The invasion window, they said, was closed. This confidence trickled down through every level of command. From the highest generals to the soldiers huddled in their concrete bunkers along the Normandy coast. The night of June 5th was just another miserable, stormy night. They played cards, wrote letters home, and listened to the radio, oblivious to the immense shadow gathering just across the water. This sense of security was a fatal miscalculation, born from a mix of arrogance, faulty intelligence, and a dash of wishful thinking. German intelligence was convinced the main assault would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest distance across the Channel. They had swallowed the bait of a massive Allied deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, which used phantom armies, inflatable tanks, and fake radio traffic to create the illusion of a massive buildup. Opposite Calais, Normandy was considered a feint, a secondary target at best. So, while the German 15th Army sat guarding the wrong stretch of coast, the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword lay relatively exposed. The few who did feel a flicker of unease were dismissed as alarmists. Colonel General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army, noted in his diary that evening, "The weather is so bad, the sea so rough, that I can't imagine any large-scale landing operations." Even the reports of increased Allied air activity and coded messages picked up by radio intercepts were brushed aside. One famous message from the BBC, a line from a Verlaine poem, was a prearranged signal for the French resistance to begin their sabotage operations. A German intelligence officer who intercepted it tried to raise the alarm, but his superiors shrugged it off. It was just another piece of noise in the grand symphony of war. As the clock ticked past midnight, the storm began to show the slightest signs of breaking. A small, almost imperceptible lull in the wind and rain. It was a window of opportunity, a meteorological gamble that the Allied Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had decided to take while German commanders slept soundly. The largest amphibious force ever assembled was already slicing through the choppy waters of the Channel. Over 5,000 ships, carrying more than 150,000 men, were steaming towards the Normandy coast. Above them, the sky was beginning to fill with the drone of thousands of aircraft carrying paratroopers, the vanguard of the invasion. The quiet night was a lie. It was the deep, deceptive breath before the plunge. The complacency that filled the German headquarters was a poison that had lulled the defenders of Fortress Europe into a false sense of security. They believed they were safe behind their concrete walls, protected by the wrath of the sea. They had analyzed the logic of war, the timing, the weather, the tides, and concluded that an attack was impossible. But they had failed to account for the sheer audacity and desperation of their enemy. They had failed to understand that on this night, The impossible was about to happen. Inside the bunkers along the Normandy beaches, the first reports began to trickle in just after midnight. Strange sightings, parachutes spotted inland, the sound of planes where there should be none. At first, they were dismissed as minor incursions, perhaps just a few spies or saboteurs, but the reports kept coming, growing in number and urgency. The war games in Rennes were abruptly cancelled. Phones began to ring off the hook in headquarters across France. Officers were roused from their beds, struggling to make sense of the chaotic, fragmented information. Was this it? Was this the real thing, or just another elaborate Allied trick? The confusion was immense. Rommel was unreachable. Driving through the night on his way home, many other key commanders were scattered. The rigid German command structure, which required approval from the highest levels to move major units like the Panzer divisions, became a paralyzing bottleneck. The armored reserves, the very forces that could have crushed the landings at their most vulnerable moment on the beaches, were held back, waiting for an order from Hitler himself, who was still sound asleep, and had left strict instructions not to be disturbed. The quiet night had shattered into 1,000 pieces of chaos and uncertainty. The storm that the Germans had trusted for protection had become the cloak for their enemy's advance. The confidence of a few hours earlier had evaporated, replaced by a frantic scramble for information and a dawning horror. The greatest invasion in history was underway, and the defenders had been caught completely, catastrophically, by surprise. The quiet before the storm had ended. The storm had arrived. Imagine the scene just after midnight on June 6, 1944. The coast of Normandy is shrouded in a tense, expectant darkness. For the German soldiers stationed along the Atlantic Wall, it's just another night of waiting. But in the dimly lit radar stations and command posts, something is stirring. The air itself seems to crackle with an unseen energy. On the glowing green screens of the German Freya and Wurzburg radars, strange blips begin to appear. At first, they're dismissed. Maybe it's just atmospheric interference, or window. The code name for the metallic strips the Allies dropped confused their systems. But the blips keep coming. They're too numerous, too organized. They move with a purpose that sends a chill down the spines of the young operators staring at their screens. These aren't just ghosts in the machine. This is something real. Simultaneously, along the coast, sentries strained their ears against the sound of the waves. A low, continuous rumble begins to fill the night. It's a sound unlike any they've ever heard. It's not thunder. It's the drone of thousands of aircraft engines, a skyborne armada crossing the English Channel. Then, the reports start flooding in. Frantic phone calls from isolated observation posts. Whispers of dark shapes descending from the sky. Paratroopers. They're landing inland, behind the main coastal defenses, at a coastal command post near Saint-Mere. Eglias, a young lieutenant, stares at a map, his hand trembling slightly as he plots the incoming reports. Paratroopers here, near the river crossings. More over there, near key road junctions. The pattern is chaotic, yet terrifyingly clear. This isn't a small-scale raid. It's a full-blown, airborne assault. He picks up the phone, his voice urgent, trying to convey the scale of what's happening to his superiors. But the German command structure is a labyrinth of confusion and conflicting authority. Who is in charge? Where is the real threat? The reports are passed up the chain of command, from one headquarters to another. At each step, vital minutes are lost. The information gets diluted, questioned, and often disbelieved. Many senior commanders are away from their posts, attending war games in Rennes, convinced that any landing would come at Pas de Calais, the closest point to England, and certainly not in Normandy, especially not in this poor weather. Think of Major Werner Pluscat at the 352nd Infantry Division's coastal battery, peering through his powerful artillery binoculars at dawn. He sees something impossible. The horizon isn't empty. It's filled with ships, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. A forest of masts and hulls, stretching as far as the eye can see. He scrambles to the phone, screaming to his headquarters. It's the invasion. It's here. But even his frantic eyewitness account is met with skepticism. Are you sure? It can't be that many. The sea is too rough. The problem was systemic. Authority was fractured. The army controlled the infantry. The navy controlled the coastal guns. And the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had its own separate command. To launch a coordinated counterattack, multiple commanders needed to agree, and one of the most crucial elements, the elite Panzer divisions held in reserve, could only be released by one man, Adolf Hitler. And at this critical hour, Hitler was asleep at his retreat in Berchtesgaden, with strict orders not to be disturbed. No one dared to wake him. So, as thousands of paratroopers secured bridges and crossroads, and as the largest amphibious force in history steamed towards the beaches, the German response was the radar operators saw them coming. The coastal lookouts heard the planes. The frontline officers reported the landings. All the pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered across various command posts in Normandy, but there was no single hand with the authority to put them together. The men on the ground were left to fight isolated, desperate battles. A company commander here, a battery captain there. They did their duty with the limited resources they had. They fired on the landing craft they could see. They engaged the paratroopers they encountered, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sandbags. The system designed to repel the invasion was, in its most critical moment, crippled by its own complexity and by the hubris of its high command. This lack of a decisive, immediate counter-thrust was perhaps the single most important factor in the Allies' success on D. The initial German reports, filled with the raw, terrifying truth of the invasion, were lost in a bureaucratic fog. The first reports arrived, but they fell on deaf ears or were tangled in red tape. The defenders had detected the blow. They had felt the initial shock, but they were powerless to strike back effectively. The golden hours, the crucial window of opportunity to throw the invaders back into the sea, were ticking away, and with every passing minute of indecision, the Allied foothold on the shores of France grew stronger, more permanent, and ultimately unstoppable. The fate of the war was being decided not just by the soldiers on the beaches, but by the unanswered phone calls and the unread reports in the quiet command posts of a sleeping Reich. It's the dead of night, June 6th, 1944. 3 in the morning, on the beaches of Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in human history is underway. The air is thick with the roar of planes, the thunder of naval guns, and the desperate cries of men. The fate of the world hangs in the balance. But deep beneath the ground, in the surreal quiet of the wolf's lair, the supreme commander of the German forces is fast asleep, and nobody dares to wake him up. This isn't a joke. It's one of the most bizarre, almost unbelievable footnotes to the D-Day story. As thousands of Allied soldiers stormed to the beaches, creating a foothold in Fortress Europe, Adolf Hitler was in his bunker, lost in a drug-induced slumber, and his inner circle, the generals and officers responsible for the defense of the Reich, were paralyzed, not by the invasion, but by fear. Fear of waking the Führer. To understand this, you have to picture the atmosphere in Hitler's headquarters. By 1944, the Führer was no longer the charismatic leader of the 1930s. He was a physically and mentally deteriorating man, sustained by a daily cocktail of drugs administered by his personal physician, Dr. Morel. His moods were volatile, his rages legendary. He demanded absolute obedience and had created a culture where no one dared to be the bearer of bad news. Questioning his judgment or interrupting his routine was a career-ending and sometimes life-ending mistake. So, as the first frantic reports of parachute landings trickled in, a strange and deadly farce began to unfold. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations staff, received the initial intelligence. His assessment, this was likely a diversion, a feint designed to draw German forces away from the real target, which he and Hitler firmly believed would be the Pas de Calais. He saw no reason to disturb the Führer for what he considered a minor disruption. Meanwhile, in France, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the West, was getting a clearer, more terrifying picture. He knew this was no diversion. This was the real thing. He urgently needed the Panzer divisions held in reserve. But there was a problem. WWII. These elite armored units, the only force capable of throwing the Allies back into the sea. could not be moved without a direct order from Hitler himself. Imagine the desperation. Von Rundstedt and his staff are on the phone, pleading with Jodel's team at the Wolf's Lair. They're describing a massive naval armada, thousands of ships, wave after wave of landing craft. The scale is unprecedented, but the answer from headquarters is always the same. The Führer is sleeping. We cannot wake him. It sounds like something out of a dark comedy, but for the German soldiers on the Normandy coast, it was a death sentence. Hours ticked by. 3 a.m. became 4 a.m. The Allied beachheads grew stronger with every passing minute. Every moment of German indecision was paid for in blood and lost ground. The commanders in the field, like the legendary Erwin Rommel, who was unfortunately away from the front, celebrating his wife's birthday back in Germany, had long warned that the invasion must be defeated on the beaches within the first 24 hours. They knew that if the Allies established a secure foothold, it would be impossible to dislodge them. That crucial window, those golden hours, were slipping away while the one man who could authorize a decisive counterattack was dreaming. The fear in the bunker was palpable. These were hardened military men, veterans of countless campaigns. Yet, they were reduced to frightened subordinates, tiptoeing around their sleeping leader. The system Hitler had built, a system based on absolute personal loyalty and the centralization of all power in his hands, was now catastrophically failing him. His own cult of personality had become his greatest strategic weakness. No one was willing to risk his wrath, even with the fate of the war at stake. It wasn't until around 10 in the morning, after his usual leisurely wake-up routine and breakfast, that Hitler was finally informed of the invasion. By then, it was 7 to 8 hours after the first boots hit the sand. He initially reacted with glee, believing the Allies had fallen into his trap and would be ILA. He confidently released the Panzer reserves, but it was too little, too late. The critical moment had passed. The Allies had clawed their way off the beaches, survived the initial onslaught, and were beginning to push inland. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. This single episode, this fear to wake the Führer, perfectly encapsulates the dysfunction at the heart of the Nazi high command. It was a regime that prioritized the whims of a single man over military reality. The generals on the ground had their hands tied, unable to react to the rapidly changing battlefield situation. Because of a rigid, top-down command structure that all led to a sleeping, drugged despot. It is a chilling reminder of how the toxic culture of a dictatorship can lead to its own downfall. While Allied soldiers fought with courage and initiative on the beaches, German commanders were hamstrung by a bureaucracy of fear. The most powerful man in Germany was unreachable, and because of that, the beginning of the end for the Third Reich had truly begun. The failure wasn't just on the beaches of Normandy. It was in the silent, terrified corridors of the Wolf's Lair, where no one dared to wake the sleeping. June 6, 1944. As thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the most powerful man in Germany was fast asleep. This is the incredible, almost unbelievable story of the morning. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and Adolf Hitler was blissfully unaware. It's around 10 a.m. at the Berghof, Hitler's idyllic mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. The air is fresh. The scenery is breathtaking. But inside, the atmosphere is thick with a tension you could cut with a knife. 4 hours. Urgent messages have been flooding in from the front lines in France. Reports of paratroopers landing, ships amassing off the coast, a full-scale invasion. General Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, two of Hitler's most senior military advisors, are pacing, their faces etched with anxiety. They know the situation is critical, but they face a dilemma that sounds almost absurd. Nobody dares to wake the few. You have to understand the routine at the Berghof. It was a bizarre bubble, completely detached from the grim realities of the war. Hitler's daily schedule was notoriously eccentric. He would often stay up until the early hours of the morning, watching movies, listening to music, and engaging in long, rambling monologues with his inner circle. Consequently, he rarely woke before 10 or 11 a.m., and sometimes even as late as noon. His adjutants and valets had a strict, unspoken rule. The Führer is not to be disturbed. Waking him with bad news was considered career suicide, or worse, it was a terrifying prospect. In his world, shooting the messenger wasn't just a metaphor. So, 4 hours, as the Allied foothold in Normandy grew stronger, Germany's high command was paralyzed. They had the reports. They knew the scale of the landings, but they couldn't make the most crucial decisions without Hitler's direct approval. This was especially true for the Panzer divisions held in reserve near Paris. These powerful tank units were the key to throwing the Allies back into the sea, but they were under Hitler's personal command. Only he could release them. And he was sleeping. Imagine the scene. Jodl and Keitel, two of the most powerful military men in the Third Reich, are essentially wringing their hands. They look at the clock. They look at the telexes piling up. Every minute that passes, the Allied position gets stronger. Every minute of inaction is a disaster. They debate. They argue. Who will be the one to go? Who will take that terrifying walk to Hitler's bedroom door and break the news that could trigger one of his infamous volcanic rages? The man who finally drew the short straw was likely a military adjutant, a lower-ranking officer whose name is lost to the chaos of history. Picture this young man, his heart pounding in his chest, walking down the quiet, polished corridors of the Berghof. He approaches the Fuhrer's private chambers. The guards standing outside are stoic, but even they must have felt the electric tension in the air. He takes a deep breath, knocks softly on the heavy wooden door. Silence. He knocks again, a little louder this time. Finally, a sleepy, irritated voice from within. Hitler is awake. The adjutant enters, bracing himself. He delivers the news as calmly as he can. Main 4. The invasion has begun. Now, what happens next is the subject of some debate among historians, but the most common accounts paint a picture not of immediate fury, but of something far stranger. Disbelief and even a bizarre sense of elation. Hitler's initial reaction wasn't panic. He reportedly came out of his room, still in his dressing gown, and went to the Situation Room. He looked at the maps, at the pins marking the Allied landings. Instead of exploding, he seemed almost pleased. Why? Because for months, Hitler had been obsessed with the idea of the Allied invasion. He was convinced it was coming, but he and his high command believed the main attack would be at the narrowest point of the English Channel. The Normandy landings, he thought, were just a feint, a diversion designed to draw German forces away from the real invasion site. He famously declared, "The news couldn't be better. Now we have them where we can destroy them." This catastrophic miscalculation was born from a mixture of arrogance, delusion, and a successful Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude. The Allies had created an entire phantom army in southeast England, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, all pointed at Calais, and Hitler bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. So, as his generals pleaded with him to release the Panzer reserves, to crush the Normandy beachhead, Hitler refused. He was convinced he was playing a brilliant strategic game, waiting for the main blow to fall at Calais. He ordered the tanks to stay put. He saw the Normandy landings not as the decisive moment of the war, but as a trap he was cleverly avoiding. His officers were aghast. They could see the reality of the situation. This was no feint. This was the real thing, a massive, overwhelming force. But arguing with Hitler was futile. His reality had diverged completely from theirs. He dismissed their concerns, believing he saw the bigger picture that they were all missing. He went about his day, had his usual late breakfast, and prepared for his midday military conference, confident that his genius was about to deliver a decisive victory. This delay, this series of crucial hours wasted because of one man's sleeping habits, and his subsequent, monumental misjudgment, was one of the most significant turning points of World War II. Those Panzer divisions, which could have potentially wreaked havoc on the vulnerable Allied troops just coming ashore, were a little back. By the time Hitler finally realized his mistake and released them, it was too late. The Allies had secured their beachheads, brought in reinforcements, and established a firm foothold in France. The window of opportunity to repel the invasion had slammed shut. It is a chilling testament to how the fate of millions can be dictated by the whims and delusions of a single individual, isolated from reality in his mountain fortress. The image of Hitler, serene and confident in his misjudgment, while his empire began to crumble, is one of the most surreal and defining moments of the entire war. The delay in waking him was just the first in a chain of errors that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Third Reich. As the first rays of dawn broke over Europe on June 6, 1944, a wave of steel and men crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. Paratroopers were already scattered behind enemy lines. Naval guns were thundering, and thousands of Allied soldiers were wading ashore into a storm of German fire. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway. Codenamed Operation Overlord, this was the moment the Allies had been planning for years, but hundreds of miles away, at his Berghof retreat in the Bavarian Alps. The one man whose every whim dictated the German war effort was still sound asleep. That man was Adolf Hitler. No one dared to wake the four. His routine was sacrosanct. He often stayed up late watching films, and would only rise around 10 or 1 a.m. His military staff, including generals like Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel, at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, were paralyzed by this. They had received fragmented, confusing reports of landings since just after midnight, but the scale was unclear. Was this the main invasion, or just a diversionary raid? The critical Panzer divisions, the backbone of Germany's defensive power in the West, were held in reserve, and only one person could release them: Hitler. As the minutes and hours ticked by, and Allied soldiers fought and died to gain a foothold on French soil, the most powerful man in Germany slumbered, oblivious. When Hitler finally awoke and appeared for his daily military briefing around noon, he was greeted not with panic, but with an almost bizarre sense of calm and optimism. The initial reports were now consolidated. Significant landings were happening in Normandy. But instead of alarm, Hitler greeted the news with something close to glee. For months, he had been absolutely convinced that the main Allied invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It was the most logical choice, closest to Britain, offering the shortest sea route and the quickest path to Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. All his strategic planning and the placement of his strongest forces, the 15th Army, were centered around this assumption. So, when told the Allies were hitting the beaches of the Cotentin Peninsula, Hitler's reaction was immediate and unwavering. "So, the news is no worse than we expected," he reportedly said with a smile. To him, this wasn't the real thing. It couldn't be. This was a feint, a clever, large-scale diversion designed to draw his powerful reserves away from the asterisk. Real asterisk prize. He saw it as a classic misdirection play, and he wasn't going to fall for it. His infamous intuition, a gut feeling that had admittedly served him well in the early years of the war, was now his greatest weakness. He dismissed the urgency of his generals, who were beginning to grasp the sheer magnitude of the Normandy operation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, and the legendary Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B defending the coastline, were desperate for reinforcements. Rommel, who was unfortunately away from the front celebrating his wife's birthday, had been arguing for weeks that the invasion had to be defeated on the beaches. On the very first day, he knew that if the Allies established a secure beachhead and could pour in their overwhelming superiority in men and material, the war would be lost. He and Rundstedt pleaded for the release of the Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division, two elite armored units stationed near Paris, perfectly positioned to race to Normandy and drive the Allies back into the sea. But Hitler's verdict was absolute. "It's just a diversion," he repeated. He saw the Normandy landings as a trap. The Allies wanted him to commit his panzers, his most precious mobile reserve, to a secondary battle. Once they were tied down in Normandy, the real asterisk invasion force would storm ashore at Calais. He was certain of it. His entire strategic worldview was built on this premise, fueled by a complex Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, which had brilliantly created a phantom army in southeast England, complete with fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and the well-known General George S. Patton as its commander, all pointing toward Calais. The deception was so effective it had completely captured Hitler's imagination. So, the panzers stayed put. Hitler explicitly forbade Jodl from moving them towards the coast. He believed the poor weather that morning, which had so hampered the Allied landings, also made a larger invasion elsewhere impossible for now. He reasoned they should wait for a clearer picture. let the Allies commit more troops to this Normandy trap. And then, when the real blow fell at Calais, his 15th Army would be waiting, fresh and at full strength. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Every hour that passed, the Allied beachhead in Normandy grew stronger, more organized, and more difficult to dislodge. The window of opportunity to smash the invasion on the beaches, as Rommel had feared, was closing with terrifying speed. By the afternoon, as Hitler sat down for a leisurely lunch with his inner circle, the situation in Normandy was becoming a brutal reality for the German soldiers on the ground. But in the rarefied air of the Berghof, it was just pins on a map, and a problem that seemed to confirm Hitler's own strategic genius. He was reportedly in high spirits, convinced the Allies had made a fatal error. He told his staff that now the enemy was finally out in the open. They could be annihilated. The initial confusion and paralysis of the German High Command, caused by the Führer's absence, had now given way to a fatal, misguided confidence, dictated by one man's unshakable obsession. This single decision, made in a groggy state just after waking, based on a fixed idea, and a brilliant Allied deception, was perhaps one of the most critical turning points of the Second World War. By refusing to believe the truth of what was happening on those 5 beaches, Uto, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword Hitler effectively handed the Allies the time they desperately needed. He kept his strongest cards in his hand, waiting for a game that was never going to be played. The die was cast, not by the generals on the scene, but by a dictator hundreds of miles away, who saw a massive invasion and called it a feint. The road to Paris, and ultimately to Berlin, was being paved on the sands of Normandy, while the architect of the Third Reich looked completely in the wrong direction. Ever heard the saying, all's fair in love and war? Well, in World War II, the Allies took that to a whole new level. We all know about D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. But what if I told you the success of that monumental day depended almost entirely on a lie? A massive, intricate, and brilliantly executed deception involving inflatable tanks, phantom armies, and one of the greatest double agents who ever lived. This is the story of Operation Fortitude, the ghost army that haunted Hitler's every decision and ultimately sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The year is 1944. The Allies are gearing up for the big one, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Everyone, especially the Germans, knew an attack was coming. The big questions were where and when. The most logical place was the Pas de Calais. It's the narrowest point of the English Channel, offering the shortest sea route and the quickest path to Germany. The German High Command, and Hitler himself, were absolutely convinced this was the target. And the Allies, well, the Allies were more than happy to help them believe it. This is where Operation Fortitude comes in. It was a masterclass in misdirection, designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion force would land at Calais, not Normandy. The plan had 2 main parts: Fortitude North, which threatened Norway, and the star of our show; Fortitude South, which pointed directly at Calais. To pull this off, the Allies needed to create a completely fictional army group, one so large and convincing that the Germans would have no choice but to keep their best troops waiting for it. And so, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, was born. On paper, it was a million-strong behemoth, a force more than capable of spearheading the invasion of Europe. In reality, it was a phantom, a figment of imagination brought to life by Hollywood set designers, sound engineers, and military strategists. Across the fields of East Anglia and Kent, directly opposite Calais, a strange new landscape began to appear. From the air, German reconnaissance planes would see sprawling military camps, endless rows of tanks, and bustling airfields. But if they could get a closer look, they'd realize something was off. Those Sherman tanks, they were inflatable rubber dummies. The hundreds of landing craft bobbing in the harbors, mostly canvas and wood props. The supply depots, cleverly disguised empty boxers. This wasn't just about visual tricks. The Allies created the illusion of a massive army in constant motion. They used special sonic units to broadcast the sounds of tank movements, troop chatter, and construction noise across the countryside. They even generated fake radio traffic endless streams of coded messages. logistical orders, and mundane chatter all designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. It was a full-scale theatrical production, and the target audience was one man, Adolf Hitler. And at the heart of this ghost army, it needed a commander. A real one. Someone with a reputation so fierce, so respected, that the Germans would believe he could only be leading the main attack. The choice was perfect. General George S. Patton. After the infamous slapping incident in Sicily, Patton was in the doghouse, sidelined from the real invasion planning. But to the Germans, he was still the Allies' best, most aggressive field commander. Placing him in charge of the fictional Fusag was a stroke of genius. The Germans tracked his movements, saw him reviewing his troops, and their conviction grew stronger. Where Patton is, the real invasion will be. But visual and audio deception wasn't enough. The Allies needed to get inside the German High Command's head. They needed a direct line to their intelligence network. Inter Juan Pujol Garcia, Spanish chicken farmer, tend to spy. Cadinem de Garboum by the British. Garbo was, without a doubt, the most important and successful double agent of the war. Initially, he had tried to spy for the British, but they turned him down. Undeterred, he got himself recruited by German intelligence, the Opfair, and moved to Lisbon. From there, he started creating a network of imaginary sub-agents, feeding the Germans a mix of believable but harmless information, late reports, and pure fiction, all based on things he read in tourist guides and newspapers. His reports were so detailed and plausible that the Germans were completely hooked. They thought he was their master spy in Britain. Finally, the British intelligence service, MI5, realized what a gem they had. They brought Garbo to London and set him up. Now, with access to real, but carefully controlled, information, Garbo's network of 27 fictional agents became the main channel for feeding Operation Fortitude. Lies directly to Berlin. As D-Day approached, Garbo's radio traffic intensified. His agents reported massive troop concentrations in Kent and Sussex. They described the new patent shoulder patches on the soldiers. They passed on details of FUSAG's preparations, all pointing Leslie to an imminent attack on the Pas de Calais. The Germans swallowed it. Hook, line, and sinker. Garbo was so trusted that on the morning of June 6th, when Allied troops were already storming the beaches of Normandy, he sent an urgent message to his German handlers. He claimed the Normandy landings were just a diversion, a feint to draw German reserves away from the real target. Calais, this was the critical moment. The German High Command was in chaos. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding the defenses in France, wanted to move his powerful Panzer divisions to Normandy immediately. But Hitler, thousands of miles away in his headquarters, hesitated. His most trusted intelligence, fed by Garbo, and the evidence of FUSAG's existence, all told him this was a trap. He was convinced the main blow was yet to fall at Calais, so he made a fateful decision. He ordered the powerful 15th Army, including numerous panzer divisions recuperaquad at Calais, to stay put. 4 weeks after D-Day, as the Allies struggled to establish their beachhead in Normandy, Hitler kept his best troops waiting for a phantom invasion that would never come. The ghost army, the rubber tanks, and the imaginary spies had done their job. They held a real, powerful German army in place, preventing them from counterattacking the vulnerable Allied forces in Normandy. This crucial delay gave the Allies the time they desperately needed to land more troops, more supplies, and to secure their foothold in France. By the time Hitler finally realized he'd been duped and released the 15th Army, it was too late. The Normandy bridgehead was secure, and the path to Berlin was open. Operation Fortitude is a testament to the power of imagination and ingenuity in warfare. It proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but an idea, a carefully crafted lie, delivered with conviction, that can fool a dictator and change the course of history. The soldiers who landed on those Normandy beaches were incredibly brave, but they were supported by an army that wasn't even there. The silent, spectral heroes of the Ghost Army. As noon approached on June 6th, a storm of frantic messages began to batter the German High Command. From the front lines in Normandy, commanders were practically screaming for help. Their urgent pleas all carried the same desperate message. Send the panzers. No. Field Marshal Gerd. Von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the west, saw the terrifying reality unfolding on the Normandy coast. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not a feint. This was the real invasion, the one they had dreaded for years. The Allied foothold was tenuous, a fragile beachhead carved out of fire and blood. But if it wasn't crushed immediately, it would grow, strengthen, and become an unstoppable cancer eaten into the heart of their defenses. Von Rundstedt's headquarters, located in the quiet elegance of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, became a hive of frantic activity. He and his chief of staff, General Gunther Blum, were on the phone constantly, trying to impress upon the higher echelons the gravity of the situation. Every report from the coast painted a more dire picture. The coastal fortifications, the vaunted Atlantic Wall, were being systematically dismantled. Infantry divisions were being bled white, unable to hold back the tide of men and machines pouring ashore. We must smash them on the beaches. Von Rundstedt had always argued, if they get a foothold, we will lose. Now, his worst fears were materializing. The only tool he had that could possibly throw the Allies back into the sea was his armored fist. The Panzer divisions. But these powerful units were held in reserve, shackled by a complex and disastrous command structure. The key Panzer divisions near the invasion area, like the 21st Panzer, the 12th SS Panzer, and the elite Panzer Lehr, were not under von Rundstedt's direct command for this exact situation. They were part of the OKW Reserve, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and could only be released by one man: Adolf Hitler. This was a critical flaw in the German defense plan. Hitler, convinced that the main Allied attack would come at the narrowest point of the English Channel, was hoarding these elite divisions to meet that phantom threat. So, as the precious hours of daylight slipped away, von Rundstedt and Blumentritt began a desperate bureaucratic battle. They sent teletype after teletype to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof and the Bavarian Alps. The messages were unequivocal. The invasion is here, they stated. All signs point to Normandy as the main effort. Request immediate release of panzer reserves to counterattack. Blumentritt got on the line with General Alfred J., chief of the operations staff at OKW. The conversation was tense. Blumentritt laid out the facts. The scale of the landings, the massive naval bombardment, the paratrooper drops deep inland. This was no diversion. This was it. He practically begged Jodl to wake the Führer and get the release order. But Hitler was asleep. No one in his inner circle dared to wake him. His routine was notoriously nocturnal, often staying up until the early hours of the morning and sleeping late. His aides, including Jodl, were terrified of disturbing him with what might, in Hitler's view, be premature or incorrect information. What if this really was just a diversion, and they committed the panzers to Normandy, only for the main blow to fall at Calais? The Führer's wrath would be terrible. So, Jodl prevaricated. He told Blumentritt that the situation was still unclear. He needed more information, more confirmation. He refused to wake Hitler. The Führer must not be disturbed, was the infuriating, unbelievable response. For the commanders on the front line, this was a death sentence. They could hear the sounds of battle, see the endless fleet of ships on the horizon. To them, the situation was anything but unclear. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, and directly responsible for the coastal defense, was in an even worse position. He was on his way back from Germany, having been on leave for his wife's birthday, completely caught off guard by the invasion. He had spent months arguing for the panzers to be positioned close to the coast, ready to strike instantly. He had lost that argument to von Rundstedt, who preferred a central reserve. Now, in the ultimate irony, both men were united in their desperate need for those very divisions, but both were powerless to move them. As the afternoon wore on, the German command structure descended into a state of paralysis. At the front, the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene effectively on its own, was fighting It launched a counterattack between the British Sword and Juno beaches, causing some initial panic. For a brief moment, it seemed like a single Panzer division might just be able to break through to the sea and split the beachhead. But without support, facing overwhelming air power and naval gunfire, its attack faltered. The division was mauled, its strength sapped for little strategic gain. This isolated action only highlighted what von Rundstedt knew. A coordinated, powerful armored counterattack was essential. A single division was not enough. He needed Panzer Lehr, the 12th, SS, and more. By mid-afternoon, the pressure from the west was unbearable. Von Rundstedt made another, even more forceful plea. He essentially told OKW that if the panzers were not released by the end of the day, the beachhead would be secured by the Allies, and the battle for Normandy, and perhaps for France itself, would be lost before it had even truly begun. He warned that the opportunity was fleeting. Every minute they delayed, more Allied troops, more tanks, and more supplies were pouring onto the shore. The small window to crush the invasion at its most vulnerable point was closing fast. Finally, around 3 p.m., after hours of agonizing delay, the order came. But it wasn't the decisive command von Rundstedt needed. Hitler, now awake and briefed, only released the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr. He still held other divisions in reserve, still clinging to the belief that Calais was the real target. The order was too little and far too late. Now, a new problem emerged. Moving these divisions to the front, the Allies had total air supremacy. The skies over France were swarming with Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and Typhoon's fighter bombers that the Germans called jabots. For the panzer columns, moving in broad daylight was suicide. The roads were a death trap. Bridges had been destroyed, railway lines cut. The journey to the front, which should have taken hours, would now take days, a grueling crawl under constant threat from the air. The desperate pleas of noon had turned into the bitter reality of the afternoon. The German command's indecision, Hitler's obsession with Calais, and the paralysis at the highest levels had given the Allies the one thing they needed more than anything else. Time to land more troops. Time to unload their own tanks. Time to push inland and consolidate their gains. Von Rundstedt had seen the danger with perfect clarity, but his hands were tied. The armored fist he needed to deliver a knockout blow remained clenched in reserve until the moment had passed. The fate of D-Day, and the war in the West, was being sealed, not just by the soldiers on the beaches, but by the fatal indecision in a headquarters hundreds of miles away. Weeks before the first Allied soldiers set foot on the Normandy beaches, a German field marshal was wrestling with a premonition, a chilling certainty that would echo through history. His name was Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his words were a stark warning to the German High Command. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, he wrote. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day. But his most urgent, most desperate plea was even more specific. He believed that if the invasion force was unthrown back into the sea within the first 6 hours, the war would be lost for Germany. 6 hours. That was the window. Why was Rommel so convinced of this razor-thin margin for success? To understand his thinking, we have to put ourselves in his boots. Standing on the windswept French coast in the spring of 1944, he wasn't just a brilliant tactician, he was a pragmatist who understood the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. He had witnessed firsthand in North Africa what happened when the Allies achieved air supremacy. He knew that once they established a foothold on the continent, their industrial might and overwhelming air power would make it impossible to dislodge them. Rommel envisioned a scenario where Allied bombers would relentlessly pound German supply lines, railways, and reinforcements, effectively isolating the Normandy battlefield. Any German panzer divisions trying to rush to the coast would be sitting ducks from the air. He knew that without fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, even the most elite German units would be slowly and systematically ground down. The vast, open fields of France, unlike the deserts of Africa, offered little cover. It would be a slaughter. So, for Rommel, the battle wasn't about the fields of France or the road to Paris. The entire war hinged on those few hundred yards of sand and shingle along the coastline. His strategy, therefore, was singularly focused. Turn the beaches into a death trap. He poured his energy into fortifying what he called the Atlantic Wall, but not in the way Hitler envisioned it, as an impenetrable concrete fortress. Rommel knew he didn't have the resources for that. Instead, he focused on creating a lethal, deep defensive zone, starting in the water itself. He ordered millions of mines to be laid, not just on the beaches, but offshore, in the shallow waters where landing craft would approach. He designed vicious-looking obstacles, like jagged steel structures nicknamed Setschadiogs, and angled wooden poles tipped with mines, which the Germans called Rommel, or Rommel's asparagus. The idea was to rip the bottom out of landing craft before they even reached the shore, or to impale gliders landing inland. Every inch of the landing zone was to be a maze of explosives and sharpened steel, designed to inflict maximum chaos and casualties the very moment the invasion began. He reasoned that if the Allies could be stopped in the surf, pinned down on the beaches, and torn apart by pre-sighted artillery and machine guns, their invasion would stall. The initial wave would be annihilated, the follow-on forces would be unable to land, and the entire operation would collapse under its own weight. It was a brutal, all-or-nothing gamble. Repel them in 6 hours, or face inevitable defeat. This wasn't pessimism. It was a cold, hard military calculation based on everything he had learned about his enemy. But Rommel faced an uphill battle, and not just against the Allies. His real struggle was with his own high command, and with Adolf Hitler himself. While Rommel was screaming for every available resource to be placed directly on the coast, many in the German leadership, including his superior, Gerd Rundstedt, favored a more traditional strategy. They wanted to hold the powerful Panzer divisions back, deep inland, and then unleash them in a massive, decisive counterattack. Once the main Allied landing site was confirmed, this was strategic dogma, the way things had always been done. But Rommel saw it as a fatal mistake. He argued, pleaded, and warned that by the time the Panzers were released, it would be too late. Allied air power would have already severed the arteries of the German army. The tanks would never reach the battle in time, or in sufficient numbers, to make a difference. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the coming battle. Was it a battle of maneuver, or a battle of attrition on the water's edge? Rommel was certain it was the latter. His frustration was palpable. He knew he was right, but he couldn't get the men in charge to see the world as he saw it. He didn't have direct command over the Panzer divisions. That power rested with Hitler. Rommel could only request their deployment, and his requests were being denied. The very weapon he needed to execute his 6-hour strategy, armored divisions positioned right behind the beaches, ready to storm into the landing zones. The moment the ramps dropped was being held in reserve miles away, waiting for an order that might come too late. Then came the final, fateful twist. The weather. In early June, a storm front moved into the English Channel. The seas were rough, the wind was high, and the skies were thick with clouds. German meteorologists confidently predicted that no invasion was possible for several days. Believing this, many senior German commanders relaxed. Some left their posts to attend war games in Rennes, and Erwin Rommel, exhausted and believing he had a small window of safety, decided to make a quick trip back to Germany. It was his wife's birthday on June 6th, and he wanted to surprise her. He also planned to go directly to Hitler to once again plead his case for control of the Panzer divisions. He left the coast on June 4th. As Rommel was traveling, the Allied commander, Dwight D., was staring at a different weather forecast. His meteorologists had identified a small, temporary break in the storm, a brief window of acceptable weather that would open on the night of June 5th and last through the morning of June 6th. Faced with an agonizing decision, Eisenhower made the call. "Okay, let's go." And so on the morning of June 6th, as the largest amphibious invasion force in history churned towards Normandy, Erwin Rommel, the one man who understood the stakes of the first 6 hours better than anyone, was in a car on a highway hundreds of miles away from the front. The initial reports that reached him were fragmented, dismissed by many as a feint or a small-scale raid. But as the scale of the landings became clear, a horrifying realization must have dawned on him. His 6-hour window was closing. The Panzers were not where he wanted them, and he was not there to command. The battle for the beaches raged. On some, like Utah and Sword, the Allies got ashore with relatively light casualties and pushed inland. On others, most famously Omaha Beach, Rommel's deadly vision became a terrifying reality. There, the defenses were stronger, the terrain was more difficult, and the American forces were pinned down on the beach, suffering horrendous losses. For a few desperate hours on Omaha, it seemed Rommel's strategy might just work. The invasion teetered on the brink of failure, but without the immediate, overwhelming Panzer counterattack that Rommel had planned, it wasn't enough. Courageous leadership and small unit actions on the beach eventually broke the stalemate. By midday, the crisis on Omaha had passed. The Allies were ashore. They were battered and bloodied, but they were holding on. The foothold was established. The 6-hour window had slammed shut. When Rommel finally made it back to his headquarters late on the evening of June 6th, the situation was irreversible. The Allies were on French soil to stay. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. His prophetic warnings had all come true. The air was thick with Allied fighters. German reinforcements were being decimated on the roads. The war of attrition he had so desperately tried to avoid at the water's edge was now beginning in earnest in the Hegros of Normandy, a battle Germany had no hope of winning. Rommel's warning was no longer a prediction. It was the epitaph for the Third Reich in the West. June 6th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Normandy, but it's not the sun that lights up the sky. It's the flash of naval guns, the explosion of bombs, the tracers of anti-aircraft fire. The largest amphibious invasion in history has begun. Operation Overlord is in full swing. On the beaches, men are fighting and dying, clawing their way inland, inch by bloody inch. They're facing a storm of steel, fighting for every grain of sand. The Allied High Command knows this is the most vulnerable phase of the operation. If they can't establish a secure beachhead and push inland, the entire invasion could be thrown back into the sea. And there's one thing they fear above all else: a swift, powerful, armored counterattack. The kind of blitzkrieg assault that Germany's Panzer divisions are famous for. Just miles away from the chaos, sitting in quiet French villages and hidden camouflaged positions, are the very instruments of that fear. Thousands of tons of steel, tracks, and cannons. Elite, battle-hardened Panzer divisions. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, is close enough to hear the thunder of the naval bombardment. Further back, but still within striking distance, sits the formidable Panzer, one of the most powerful armored formations in the entire German army. And nearby is the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, filled with young, fanatical, and brutally effective soldiers. Together, these units represent a mailed fist, a hammer blow ready to smash the fragile Allied beachheads before they can consolidate. They have the tanks, they have the training, they have the will. They have everything they need to turn the tide of D-Day. Everything, except one small, crucial thing: an order to move. As Allied soldiers pour ashore, the commanders of these panzer divisions are in a state of agonizing frustration. They see the reports coming in. Paratroopers landing deep inland, ships covering the horizon. The invasion is real. It's happening right now. General Edgar Futzinger, commander of the 21st Panzer, is practically begging his superiors for permission to attack. He knows that every minute wasted is a minute the Allies use to land more men, more tanks, more supplies. His reconnaissance units are already skirmishing with British paratroopers. Hubei-Seyssat, vital bridges over the Orne River. He can see the opportunity. A rapid thrust could drive a wedge between the British and Canadian beaches, sow chaos, and potentially shatter the invasion's eastern flank. The window of opportunity is wide open, but the clock is ticking, loudly. The problem is a tangled, confused, and ultimately paralyzed chain of command. The initial reports of the invasion are chaotic. Are these the main landings, or just a diversion? The German High Command is riddled with indecision. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, believes this is the main assault and wants to release the panzers immediately. But his superior Field Marshal, Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, is away in Germany for his wife's birthday. Convinced the weather is too poor for an invasion, he had designed the defenses, the Atlantic Wall, and he believed the key was to defeat the invasion on the beaches themselves. His philosophy was clear: the first 24 hours will be decisive. Yet, At the most decisive moment, he is absent. The crucial decision rests with one man, far away in his mountain retreat in Bavaria. Adolf Hitler. He alone holds the ultimate authority to release the Strategic Armored Reserve, which includes the powerful Panzer Lehr and 12th SS divisions. And Hitler is asleep. His aides are too terrified to wake him. They know his volatile temper, his rages when disturbed. So, as the fate of the war hangs in the balance, the Führer slumbers. The request to release the Panzers sits on a desk, unanswered. The chain of command has become a chain of paralysis. Von Rundstedt can't move them without Hitler's approval. The local commanders can't move without von Rundstedt's orders. It is a bureaucratic nightmare unfolding in real time while soldiers are fighting for their lives on the coast. Back in Normandy, the morning drags on. 7 a.m., 8 a.m. 9 a.m., the crews of the Panzer tanks sit, wait, and listen. They check their engines, clean their gun sights, and stare east towards the sound of battle. They are the elite of the German war machine. Warriors trained for rapid, decisive action, and they are being forced to do the one thing they are worst at. Nothing. The frustration is immense. Every soldier, from the lowest-ranking private to the division commanders, knows this is wrong. They are firefighters watching the blaze grow, with their hands tied behind their backs. The golden hours, the precious moments when a counterattack would be most effective, are slipping away, one by one. The Allied forces, meanwhile, are not waiting. They are pushing off the beaches, fighting their way inland, linking up their forces, and creating a solid foothold. Finally, in the early afternoon, a partial order comes through. The 21st Panzer Division is released, but by now, it's too late for a decisive, coordinated blow. The division moves to attack, but the battlefield has changed. The sky, once empty, now buzzes with Allied fighter bombers. The dreaded Jabos, as the Germans called them. With total air superiority, Allied aircraft circle like vultures, pouncing on any German vehicle that dares to move in daylight. Tanks that were designed to spearhead attacks are now forced to hide under trees, their movements slow and cautious. The 21st Panzer does manage to launch an attack between the British Sword and Juno beaches, even reaching the coastline for a brief, tantalizing moment. They see the sea, but they are alone. It's a pinprick, not a hammer blow. Without support, under constant air attack, and facing growing Allied strength, they are forced to pull back as darkness falls. Their chance was lost. For the other elite divisions, Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS, the approval to move only comes late in the afternoon, after Hitler finally wakes up around 3 p.m. But now they face a nightmare journey to the front. The orders are to move immediately, but moving a massive armored division isn't like flipping a switch. It's a slow, complex process, and they have to do it under a sky completely owned by the enemy. Allied air power unleashes its full fury on the roads leading to Normandy. The fighter bombers, armed with rockets, bombs, and cannons, turn the French road network into a shooting gallery. Columns of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks are strafed and bombed relentlessly. Bridges are destroyed, roads are cratered, and fuel trucks, the lifeblood of any armored unit, go up in flames. What should have been a swift deployment becomes a desperate, piecemeal crawl. The commanders watch in horror as their powerful divisions are bled white before they even see the enemy. Fritz Bayerlein, the commander of Panzer Lehr, would later describe it as a fighter-bomber racecourse. His men were veterans of the Eastern Front of North Africa, but they had never experienced anything like this. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of Allied air power was something new, and it was terrifying. Tanks weren't being destroyed by other tanks, but by planes they couldn't fight back against. By the time elements of Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS arrived near the front lines on June 7th and 8th, they were already depleted, disorganized, and exhausted. They had lost the element of surprise. The Allies were dug in, their beachhead was secure, and they were ready. The frozen panzers had thawed, but they arrived too late. The failure to launch an immediate, powerful armored counterattack on June 6th is one of the greatest what-ifs of the Second World War. Had those divisions been unleashed at dawn, Could they have driven the Allies back into the English Channel? It's impossible to say for sure, but military historians agree it would have dramatically changed the battle for Normandy, and at a terrible cost. Instead, a combination of a rigid command structure, Hitler's personal control, the absence of Rommel, an Allied air superiority left Germany's most powerful weapon on D-Day sitting idle. The clock ticked, the hours passed, and the window of opportunity slammed shut. For the men in the tanks, it was a day of bitter frustration. For the Allies on the beaches, it was a blessing they never even knew they had received. The elite Panzer division sat frozen, and in their stillness, the fate of the war was sealed. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. We'll see you in the next one. The longest day is over, but the battle for France has just begun. It's June 7th, 1944, D-Day +1. As the sun rises over the blood-soaked beaches, a fragile but tenacious Allied foothold has been established. But it's hanging by a thread. The question on every soldier's mind, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest private, is simple. Can we hold on? Across the 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the scene is one of organized chaos. The initial waves of assault troops are exhausted, depleted, but victorious. Now, the real race begins. It's a race against time, a race against the formidable German war machine, which is slowly, but surely, beginning to react. The success or failure of the entire invasion now hinges on one critical factor: logistics. Can the Allies pour men and material into their narrow beachheads faster than the Germans can bring up their powerful Panzer divisions to crush them? On Utah Beach, the American 4th Infantry Division is pushing inland, linking up with the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne who dropped behind enemy lines in the chaotic hours before dawn. Their progress is steady. They've secured their initial objectives and are now expanding the bridgehead, creating a buffer zone against the inevitable German counter. The causeways leading off the beach, once death traps, are now vital arteries pumping lifeblood into the invasion. But just a few miles down the coast, the situation at Omaha Beach is still dire. The bloody Omaha of yesterday has given way to a congested, precarious strip of sand. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions clawed their way ashore at a terrible cost. Now, on June 7th, they are desperately trying to consolidate their gains and push off the bluffs that overlook the beach. German resistance here is still fierce, with well-hidden machine gun nests and artillery continuing to rain fire down on the crowded shore. Every yard gained is paid for in blood. The German 352nd Infantry Division, thought to be miles away, had been in the right place at the wrong time for the Americans, and they are not giving up easily. Meanwhile, at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a strange and fatal misconception is taking hold. Despite the massive invasion fleet and the tens of thousands of troops already ashore in Normandy, Hitler and his high command remain convinced that this is all a feint, a diversion. The real attack, they believe, is yet to come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. This is the masterstroke of Allied deception, Operation Fortitude. A phantom army complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and the famous General George S. Patton as its commander has successfully convinced the Germans to keep their most powerful force, the 15th Army, waiting for an invasion that will never happen. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France, sees the situation far more clearly. He understands the gravity of the Normandy landings and pleads with the high command to release the Panzer reserves to counterattack immediately. He knows that if the Allies are allowed to build up their strength, they will be impossible to dislodge, but his requests are denied. Hitler himself must personally authorize the movement of these elite armored divisions, and he is fast asleep, with strict orders not to be disturbed. By the time he finally wakes up and grasps a fraction of the situation, precious hours have been lost. Back in Normandy, the British and Canadian forces on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches are facing their own challenges. They've pushed further inland on D-Day than any of the other Allied forces, but they are now running into the vanguard of the German 21st Panzer Division. This is the only major armored unit that was close enough to intervene on D-Day, and it launched a counterattack that threatened to drive a wedge between the British beaches. Though the initial German thrust was halted, Fierce tank battles are now erupting in the fields and villages south of the coastline. The strategic city of Canada objective remains firmly in German hands, a bastion that will become the site of some of the most brutal fighting in the entire Normandy campaign. By the evening of June 7th, the situation is still fluid. The Allies have landed over 150,000 men, a monumental achievement, but their 5 beachheads are not yet linked into a single, solid front. A dangerous gap still exists between the American forces at Omaha and the British at Gold. The Germans are beginning to move reinforcements towards the battle, but slowly, hampered by destroyed bridges and railways, courtesy of the Allied air forces who ruled the skies. As day turns to night, the sounds of battle give way to an eerie calm, punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery and the drone of transport planes. For the soldiers, in their freshly dug foxholes, there is little rest. They know the Germans will not give up easily. They know the enemy is gathering, preparing to strike back with all the fury they can muster. June 8th arrives. D-Day +2. The priority for Allied command is clear. Link the beachheads and deepen the lodgment. The Americans at Omaha and the British at Gold push towards each other, fighting through stubborn German pockets of resistance. In the narrow lanes and thick hedgerows of the Bocage country, every field becomes a fortress. Every hedgerow an ambush point. This is a landscape perfectly suited for defense, and the Germans are masters of it. The fighting is intimate, brutal, and slow, but the tide of men and steel is unstoppable. The artificial mulberry harbors, one of the most incredible engineering feats of the war, are beginning to take shape off the coast. These massive floating ports will allow the Allies to unload supplies directly onto the shore, bypassing the need to capture a major port city immediately. They are the key to sustaining the invasion for the weeks and months to come. An endless stream of ships arrives from England, a conveyor belt of war, bringing tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, and most importantly, fresh troops. Hitler's fatal gamble on the Pas de Calais continues to cripple the German response, even as incontrovertible evidence of the scale of the Normandy landings mounts. He cannot shake the illusion. He releases some Panzer divisions, but feeding them into the fight without a coordinated plan, allowing the Allies to deal with them one by one. Rommel's fears are being realized. The window to throw the invaders back into the sea is closing, if it hasn't closed already. By the end of June 8th, the Allies have achieved a major milestone. The 5 separate beachheads are finally connected, forming a continuous front over 50 miles long and several miles deep. They have weathered the initial shock and are now here to stay. The breakthrough has been secured. The foothold has become a lodgment. The Germans are still fighting with skill and ferocity, but they are now on the defensive, reacting to Allied moves rather than initiating their own. The race to build up forces was won by the Allies, thanks to their naval and air supremacy and a colossal failure of German intelligence. The stage is now set for the long, hard slugfest that will be the Battle of Normandy. The road to Paris is open, but it will be a long and bloody one. Join us next time as we delve into the brutal hedgerow fighting and the German struggle to contain the ever-expanding Allied bridgehead. Imagine the scene. It's early June 1944. The world holds its breath. Allied forces have just stormed the beaches of Normandy in a massive amphibious assault. But in the heart of the Third Reich, at his Berghof retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler is surprisingly calm. In fact, he's almost ... relieved. For weeks, his high command had been buzzing with anxiety, anticipating the long-awaited Allied invasion of France. Where would it come? The Pas de Calais, with its short channel crossing, seemed the obvious choice. And Hitler, a man who prided himself on his military intuition, was convinced of it. So, when news of the Normandy landings arrived on June 6th, it was filtered through this lens of expectation. His generals reported chaos, heavy fighting, and significant Allied commitment. But to Hitler, it all seemed like a brilliantly executed deception, a feint. A diversion designed to draw his elite Panzer divisions away from the real target. Calais. He had been warned by his intelligence services, particularly the Abwehr, that Normandy was a strong possibility. But Hitler trusted his gut feeling over the meticulous reports of his spies. He saw the Normandy landings not as the main event, but as the opening act of a much larger, more cunning Allied plan. At the Berghof, the atmosphere was surreal. While thousands were fighting and dying on the French coast, Hitler was entertaining guests, discussing architecture, and listening to music. He confidently told his inner circle that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The Allies had fallen into his trap. He ordered his forces to hold back, to conserve their strength, especially the powerful 15th Army stationed at Calais. He forbade the release of the Panzer reserves near Paris without his direct, personal command. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The real invasion he was so certain was coming. His generals on the ground in France were in a state of near panic. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, was frantically pleading for reinforcements. He saw with his own eyes the sheer scale of the Allied operation. The endless fleet of ships, the swarms of aircraft, the thousands of troops pouring ashore teas, was no feint. This was Italiano. Rommel, who was away from the front on June 6th, rushed back and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, bombarded Hitler's headquarters with urgent requests to release the Panzer divisions and counterattack before the Allies could establish a secure foothold. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Hitler, cocooned in his mountain fortress, dismissed their assessments as alarmist. He saw them as weak, prone to panic. He believed they lacked his strategic vision. He famously scoffed. "It's just a little reconnaissance in force. They'll be thrown back into the sea by nightfall." He went to bed on the night of June 6th, convinced that his strategy was sound and that the Allies had made a fatal error. For the next 2 days, this delusion persisted. Every report of growing Allied strength in Normandy was interpreted as part of the elaborate deception. The phantom invasion at Calais loomed larger in his mind than the real one happening right before his eyes. The critical turning point came around June 9th. 3 full days had passed since D-Day. The Allies had not been thrown back into the sea. Instead, they had linked up their beachheads, landed hundreds of thousands of men, and were pushing inland. The sheer weight of evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. There was still no sign of any landing at Calais. The Allied air forces had complete control of the skies, pulverizing German positions and transport links. The reports from the front were no longer just urgent. They were desperate. They spoke of entire divisions being decimated, of an unstoppable tide of men and material. It was in a tense briefing session on or around June 9th that the bubble finally burst. His generals, presenting maps marked with the grim reality of the situation, laid out the facts. The bridgehead was secure. Allied logistics were functioning with terrifying efficiency. The German forces in Normandy were on the verge of collapse. And still, silence from the Pas de Calais. There was a moment, a heavy pause in the room, where the elaborate fantasy Hitler had constructed collided with the brutal truth. Historians describe this as the moment Hitler finally, reluctantly, accepted reality. The flicker of realization in his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture, the grudging admission that perhaps, just perhaps, his infallible intuition had failed him. Normandy wasn't the diversion. It was the main effort, and he had catastrophically misjudged it. He finally gave the order to release the Panzer reserves and start moving forces toward the Normandy front. But it was a classic case of too little, too late. The delay was fatal. 3 days. In the context of a lightning-fast amphibious invasion, 3 days is an eternity. By the time the Panzer divisions, harassed from the air every mile of the way, began to arrive at the front, the Allies were already deeply entrenched. They had established a solid lodgment, landed their own armor, and set up a formidable defensive line. The chance for a decisive, concentrated counterattack that might have shattered the beachhead in the first 48 hours was gone. Forever, the German tanks arrived piecemeal, thrown into a brutal battle of attrition they could not win. Hitler's delay in recognizing the truth of D-Day is one of the most critical blunders of the entire war. It wasn't just a tactical error, it was a failure of leadership rooted in hubris and a detachment from reality. He had surrounded himself with yes-men, and had come to believe in his own myth of He trusted his own flawed intuition over the desperate, on-the-ground intelligence from his most experienced commanders like Rommel. This single decision to hold back his reserves while waiting for a phantom invasion, sealed the fate of his forces in France. It ensured the success of the Normandy landings and opened the door for the liberation of Western Europe. The outcome of the war wasn't decided on June 9th, but the die was cast. The moment Hitler finally accepted that Normandy was the real invasion was the moment he also had to accept that his gamble had failed, and the beginning of the end was at hand. It was a quiet, dawning horror in a mountain bunker, a realization that would echo across the battlefields of Europe and change the course of history. Imagine the scene. It's early June 1944. The world holds its breath. Allied forces have just stormed the beaches of Normandy in a massive amphibious assault. But in the heart of the Third Reich, at his Berghof retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler is surprisingly calm. In fact, he's almost ... relieved. For weeks, his high command had been buzzing with anxiety, anticipating the long-awaited Allied invasion of France. Where would it come? The Pas de Calais, with its short channel crossing, seemed the obvious choice. And Hitler, a man who prided himself on his military intuition, was convinced of it. So, when news of the Normandy landings arrived on June 6th, it was filtered through this lens of expectation. His generals reported chaos, heavy fighting, and significant Allied commitment. But to Hitler, it all seemed like a brilliantly executed deception, a feint. A diversion designed to draw his elite Panzer divisions away from the real target. Calais. He had been warned by his intelligence services, particularly the Abwehr, that Normandy was a strong possibility, but Hitler trusted his gut feeling over the meticulous reports of his spies. He saw the Normandy landings not as the main event, but as the opening act of a much larger, more cunning Allied plan. At the Berghof, the atmosphere was surreal. While thousands were fighting and dying on the French coast, Hitler was entertaining guests, discussing architecture, and listening to music. He confidently told his inner circle that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The Allies had fallen into his trap. He ordered his forces to hold back, to conserve their strength, especially the powerful 15th Army stationed at Calais. He forbade the release of the Panzer reserves near Paris without his direct, personal command. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The real invasion he was so certain was coming. His generals on the ground in France were in a state of near panic. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, was frantically pleading for reinforcements. He saw with his own eyes the sheer scale of the Allied operation. The endless fleet of ships, the swarms of aircraft, the thousands of troops pouring ashore at ease, was no feint. This was Italiano. Rommel, who was away from the front on June 6th, rushed back and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, bombarded Hitler's headquarters with urgent requests to release the Panzer divisions and counterattack before the Allies could establish a secure foothold. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Hitler, cocooned in his mountain fortress, dismissed their assessments as alarmist. He saw them as weak, prone to panic. He believed they lacked his strategic vision. He famously scoffed. "It's just a little reconnaissance in force. They'll be thrown back into the sea by nightfall." He went to bed on the night of June 6th, convinced that his strategy was sound and that the Allies had made a fatal error. For the next 2 days, this delusion persisted. Every report of growing Allied strength in Normandy was interpreted as part of the elaborate deception. The phantom invasion at Calais loomed larger in his mind than the real one happening right before his eyes. The critical turning point came around June 9th. 3 full days had passed since D-Day. The Allies had not been thrown back into the sea. Instead, they had linked up their beachheads, landed hundreds of thousands of men, and were pushing inland. The sheer weight of evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. There was still no sign of any landing at Calais. The Allied air forces had complete control of the skies, pulverizing German positions and transport links. The reports from the front were no longer just urgent. They were desperate. They spoke of entire divisions being decimated, of an unstoppable tide of men and material. It was in a tense briefing session on or around June 9th that the bubble finally burst. His generals, presenting maps marked with the grim reality of the situation, laid out the facts. The bridgehead was secure. Allied logistics were functioning with terrifying efficiency. The German forces in Normandy were on the verge of collapse. And still, silence from the Pas de Calais. There was a moment, a heavy pause in the room, where the elaborate fantasy Hitler had constructed collided with the brutal truth. Historians describe this as the moment Hitler finally, reluctantly, accepted reality. The flicker of realization in his eyes. The subtle shift in his posture. The grudging admission that perhaps, just perhaps, his infallible intuition had failed him. Normandy wasn't the diversion. It was the main effort, and he had catastrophically misjudged it. He finally gave the order to release the Panzer reserves and start moving forces toward the Normandy front. But it was a classic case of too little, too late. The delay was fatal. 3 days. In the context of a lightning-fast amphibious invasion, 3 days is an eternity. By the time the Panzer divisions, harassed from the air every mile of the way, began to arrive at the front, the Allies were already deeply entrenched. They had established a solid lodgment, landed their own armor, and set up a formidable defensive line. The chance for a decisive, concentrated counterattack that might have shattered the beachhead in the first 48 hours was gone. Forever, the German tanks arrived piecemeal, thrown into a brutal battle of attrition they could not win. Hitler's delay in recognizing the truth of D-Day is one of the most critical blunders of the entire war. It wasn't just a tactical error, it was a failure of leadership rooted in hubris and a detachment from reality. He had surrounded himself with yes-men, and had come to believe in his own myth of infancy. He trusted his own flawed intuition over the desperate, on-the-ground intelligence from his most experienced commanders like Rommel. This single decision, to hold back his reserves while waiting for a phantom invasion, sealed the fate of his forces in France. It ensured the success of the Normandy landings and opened the door for the liberation of Western Europe. The outcome of the war wasn't decided on June 9th, but the die was cast. The moment Hitler finally accepted that Normandy was the real invasion was the moment he also had to accept that his gamble had failed, and the beginning of the end was at hand. It was a quiet, dawning horror in a mountain bunker, a realization that would echo across the battlefields of Europe and change the course of history.